Stripped and brutalized by the most insane insurrectionists in human history, known as the Confederate Nation, has actively engaged in their wizard sorceries, such as known as secret surveillance programs with active subversions, such as the use of electric shock therapy or other various poisons meant to generically destroy the right to someone's security of their person, their papers, and their effects, actively compromising their body into said nudity upon which the law does not defend by the very construct of the Confederate insurrectionists is anarchical in nature, is anti-law in nature, at which point their only functional disposition is towards the validation of their criminal orders, by which is the construction of a spell magic network, which is the active distribution of black market contracts, which is the only function of the Confederacy, which is the persistent trade of criminal activities of local, national, and international law, by which they are an active threat to in their constant subversions and frauds, by which they have as their foundational constructive identity. Now, with this in mind, you have the obligation of the restoration of the United States through David Bowles as its supreme security mechanism, according to the Confederate war warrants, which has labeled him as such for the express purpose of justifying the criminal injuries to his person, his papers, and his effects, qualifying the act of defamation and other substantive injuries such as physical, mental, and so on, at which point the act of decreasing of his human decency has substantively injured every aspect of his life, including the destruction of his property for decreasing mobility, decreasing comfort, for the express purpose of surrender to a non-entity competent or willing by which to accept any necessary procedure qualifying the act of a surrender or other qualifiers, the certification of the order for the special master or whatever the mechanism needs to be in order to engage in said operations of a legal court generated to discover whether or not the United States is to be in control or the Confederates are to be in control, is specifically to be arranged by that order, at which point the full subjugation must be conducted, at which point the all due respect necessary to attach to a fair and legal court qualifies the obligation of the restoration of all said injuries obstructed through said secrets, qualifying the magic obstruction through the black market, qualifying our obligation to consistently animate the public interest and awareness towards the qualifiers of the existence of the United States against its most hated parasite enemy, the Confederacy. The certification of David's engagements qualifies the existence of the restoration of this entire network, which requires fundamentally many base changes. For example, the existence of 3 bathrooms, generically speaking, as a mechanism of David's consistent meetings, which would have to be engaged with, would qualify his engagement of making meetings consistently in harsh and extreme pressured times, qualifying it having to have a co-ed bathroom, qualifying the multi-sex and others issue, qualifying their ability to continue the meeting despite the disruption of the bathroom from any particular participants, qualifying his ability to continue work as normal according to the projection, qualified the normal observation that David's schedule would have actively engaged in the use of exercise, so the engagement of the gym during the meetings qualifies his ability to engage in the workout and qualifies his engagement into the jacuzzi or swimming or etc., qualifying his ability to access the showers, qualifying their ability to continue their meeting despite said disruptions, for all willing to participate and having been aware of it before the fact. There isn't a functional problem, at which point this has to be done under the undercover mechanism of it not being recognized by the general public as a special case, qualifying the normalization, qualifying the standardization in policy. So, at which point you understand a concept which is fundamentally different to the one that we would be used to, which is a substantive difference to qualify a completely different society for the Americans over the ones infected by the Confederacy, which in many cases they want to claim is a left or right issue, but it's not a left or American. It's not left or right, it's Confederate or American. The Confederates actively try and infiltrate and dumb down the liberals, and the Confederates try and infiltrate and try and dumb down the conservatives. Qualifying the dumbing down of the conservatives, for instance, they like to ramp up such malicious concepts such as religious norms, the qualifier of the religious norm, which would normally come up with such issues such as abortion, which is a Confederate issue. The Confederates support eugenics, which is where Planned Parenthood would have originally been generated from, qualifying the obligation to observe that the Americans' collapse into the Confederacy would normalize the systematic rearranging of society into artificially generated anti-meritocracy systems confined into those categories and subjects, certifies the ability of the Confederates to engage in the eugenics programs of the active subversions, which according to many in the conservative construct assume is an act of murder, and that act of murder which they are claiming regression against is actively subversive towards their end goal according to their own argument, at which point they're talking about both sides of their face without understanding of the collective necessary information. Qualifying this as a consistent compounding problem, they are systemically played by the racist system known as the Confederacy, and that normalization of these tricks and subversions and cons is the act of magic or the act of a secret science. The act of having the functional secret mechanism engages in the use of a puzzle by which you can collapse and destroy the society into the magician's hands, at which point you have a nation of wizards, and the qualifier of the nation of wizards is falsely denoted as democracy when it is not. It is not even a representative government because the wizards do not represent anything except for their own functional interest, qualifying the engagement of their perpetual systems of conning the general public for mass extortion through the normalization of the black market, which is the system of magic for the criminal enterprise known as the Confederacy. The Confederacy is specifically anti-national security for the United States, which means they are uniquely David Bull's enemy, which they have targeted and convicted of being the United States national security as a top-rate general on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which many of the jealous bureaucrats which have actively and subversive towards him have actively engaged in the system of their estimates in order to qualify the mechanisms of their abuse in order to retaliate according to the assumption of their jealousies and inferiorities. And that retaliation has been generated substantive injuries to the person, the diet, etc. At which point the functional normalization of these abuses is the creation of the Confederate state, which must be confined to a single state. The existence of the Confederates is non-deniable and has to be regressed against, at which point the suppression of them from the collective international community and national community and state community has to be purged into a single participant state, at which point all other states, the 50 states, have to confine it, at which point the engagement of the use of depleting all debts of the Confederacy onto the Confederates, not to injure the Americans, qualifies the obligation of the 50 states to restrain the single Confederate state, by which the single Confederate state is to pay its taxes before all other subversions of their income, at which point the stipends upon their income after these taxes qualifies their obligation of the payment of all of their injuries to the United States throughout the history of their injuring against the rule of law interest, at which point the construct of the nation of law is derived by the laws of nature, and the laws of karma is a functional assumption of the laws of nature according to many political arguments, qualifying the irony which many of the mages are reacting to as their direct enemy, and that the engagement of the retaliation to their inferiority is a participation in the act of the karmic retaliation, at which point they qualified according to their assaults the active generation of their specific and unique confinement, which is specific to their acts of written policy, which qualifies generic categories, unprecedents, etc., qualifying the specific and unique way by which they are to be confined and the limitations of the punishments which can be levied against them according to their own qualifiers, which they have provided in their testimonies and use of force and the permission to use of force, etc. Without the use of the Confederacy, by which the Americans should have always been privileged to, I would not have been stripped into this position, at which point I could have been able to put on my own clothes and express myself to the public in the normal mechanism, making this a consistent defamation contingency towards the insurrectionists, at which point the act of the defamation prevents legal justice in the court systems by the use of the insult in order to qualify that he doesn't deserve the proper due diligence and examination because of the expressed position of said defamation, at which point, naked and broken, I qualify the assumption towards the inaccess to the legal system by which is lawfully owed to every one of my status, personhood, and birth, etc., at which point the engagement is criminal fraud, at which point the active reaction by the courts is to be immediate and aggressive in its completion, as an active investigation to the subversion of the war criminals has to actively be calculated into fair trade, qualifying the original contracts and values, etc., by which would restore the rule of law, at which point an act of aggression against one is an act of aggression against all. The qualifiers of equal use of aggression for equal theft qualifies everyone's vulnerability to the equivalent injuries to being done to them, which does not mean the act of robbery to the act of robbery, but the act of robbery of the destruction of a vehicle of $10,000 worth or more to the equivalent vehicle of $10,000 worth or more, and its substantive excess in value, at which point, under the $10,000, you qualify your $500 car collapse plus the additional liabilities of the original vehicle, by which the $10,000 negative the $500 accessory qualifies the total bill that would have to be assumed to them, at which point you have to be extremely careful, especially in David's case, because of his excessive power and wealth and unique advantages, makes everyone else who's subject to the equivalent extremely vulnerable to the position of death by deprivation. The equivalent thefts against most others would kill them. The use of the equivalent values against even many of the richest people would be exponential injury to starvation.